Om Swastiastu, welcome to Usada, Bali. We offer our cultural, medicinal, and artistic content from Ubud, Bali. Your generosity will help support our artists, practitioners, and staff, and is gratefully appreciated.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this talk today. I feel very fortunate that I have here, there's a couple of people who, with social distancing, are joining us here in the studio. So it's nice to have some real faces, but we also very much appreciate your presence if you're watching. I was asked last week to come up with a title and a theme, and I very boldly just pulled out of the top of my head, Dealing with Our Demons, which is, it's a big subject actually. A very good Buddhist friend of mine who we're old friends, we go back to teachings with His Holiness about 30, 40 years. And I told him the title and he laughed. He's Italian. He says, oh man, you're going to be famous. Dealing with your demons. It's a popular theme apparently, but anyway. I chose this theme because really at the moment, I think what we're experiencing in our world for many of us is, it's almost like it's something which has never happened to us in our lifetime. It feels like that. And we have a situation where our world is, it's like it's on fire. It's on fire with fear, it's on fire with anger. And actually, these two things are very closely related, of course. We can see how fear often morphs into anger it's a kind of a reaction. And anger acts like fear's extension at a certain point. But coming to the real current things that are happening now, these anti-racism protests that are happening around the world, and the unfortunate, often disproportionate violence of the reaction against it, the repression. And it seems to us almost like this is something really shocking and really new to us. For sure, the scale is different from what we normally have experienced. We've seen protests, but it's never to the scale now that we've seen. So what we're seeing is this incredible outpouring of hate in many cases. And before this, for the last few months, we have been living in a kind of state of fear of this virus which has gone pandemic, it's gone global, it's everywhere. And there's, it reminds me of the song, nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide, because it's everywhere. And we have to deal with that. And that for us, in our lifetimes, is something new, that there's nowhere you can just escape to. You can't even dream of a place to escape to because it's everywhere and you can't see it. So the pandemic is interesting because for some people, they express it more honestly, I think. But for many of us, we do have this feeling that this virus has attacked our rights, our God-given rights. It's a funny thing for Buddhists to say, but a God-given right to these freedoms that we've enjoyed for all this time. We can go anywhere we want, but we never stop to think, many of us never stop to think that we actually, the people who think this way, who feel this way, are mostly a privileged few. There are many people in the world who don't have that facility and that possibility to just disappear and do whatever they want. And with this assault, there's this very interesting reaction that we feel like there's something intentional about it. There's an intention behind this, that somebody created this, and then, and so we start getting to the conspiracy theories. We have no real evidence, but we start manufacturing it. It becomes more and more real. So it's a very interesting psychological process that's happening, both the anger and the fear. Unfortunately, it causes a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. And that's something which we as Buddhists, we have an issue with, because what we're trying to do is overcome what we call dukkha, this constant dissatisfaction, feeling of not being, at ease, the feeling of actually experiencing pain. And then there's this kind of continuous vulnerability, what we call all-pervasive. But if we sort of take a step back and look at these things, from a Buddhist perspective, we begin to see that it's not really as we perceive it. Things aren't really as we perceive it. Now, if we look at racism that's going on in America, which is now, it's exploded into an international cause, and I actually feel that it should be something that is an international cause. But this has been going on for centuries, and it's systemic, and it's massively wrong. There's no question. It's massively wrong. But if we were honest with ourselves, we would see that it's fundamentally a very predictable rather human behavior. We are tribal. We are all tribal because we start with our families, then our tribes, and then our territories, and then our race, and actually finally it comes down to ourselves. We defend ourselves tremendously, and we have this amazing investment in the reality of ourselves. And tribalism and racism is absolutely not the exclusive territory of white colonialists or white Anglo-Saxons or white whatever. As an Indonesian, I have to admit that we are extremely racist. And we have systemic racism in Indonesia. You look at Papua, what's happening in Papua, and look what happened with the Chinese. This is systemic racism. It is something which is, in the case of Papua, it's almost institutionalized. In fact, actually, I could say it is institutionalized. So when we start looking at things that way, then we see a different perspective. And if we look at the pandemic, it's not the first time that we have, as human race, has experienced an epidemic. It's absolutely not the first time. And it's not the first time even that we've had a worldwide global pandemic. We've had the Spanish flu, which killed 100 million people, and so forth and so forth. We have the pandemics because we're more connected to each other. In medieval plague, it didn't go across the ocean. It was pretty much continental. But it's part of what we call in Buddhism an all-pervasive suffering, in the sense that we have these bodies and also the mind and so forth, which in technical terms in Buddhism we call it, we have acquired them in a contaminated manner. It's through the process of karma and the process of so forth. So these bodies and these minds are actually susceptible. They're vulnerable to suffering. And so there you go. But on the other hand, just because these things are age-old problems doesn't mean that we should just sit back and say, oh, what can you do? I mean, racism is wrong, and diseases can be handled. There's no reason for us to be totally passive and roll over and just die. Of course not. But before we start to tackle those things properly, we need to understand that when we experience the anger and the fear, they're actually not caused by those external things. The anger that we experience when we see somebody being treated unjustly and in a terrible manner, such as what happened with this poor guy, it was dreadful to watch. And if we feel this huge anger towards the perpetrators, that isn't actually coming from what's out there. It's coming from something we have inside us. And that's a really tough thing sometimes for us to accept. they are, what we're seeing are reflections, phantoms if you want, of our own hatred, our own anger, because we're reacting when we see that. I think, and I certainly experienced that same feeling when I first saw that. I had a feeling of disgust, of course, and anger towards the person who did that, to that policeman. I didn't look at that and go, wow, that's terrible. This guy he is so sick, this poor guy is so sick, but justice must be done and he should be processed by the law. But no, I was angry when I saw that. I became angry. I mean, I admit it, you know, I'm unfortunately not a very good Buddhist, so I'm just sharing with you what I know, you know. And that is a really important point. That's a really important point for us to think about. But I think we should speak out. We should say, this is wrong. We should be firm about it. We should have our voices heard. And we should be part of pushing back on that. I absolutely believe that. But we have to be careful that we don't get consumed with anger. And that sounds very goody-goody, but it's actually really important, because that anger within us perpetuates more suffering for ourselves and for others. And it's not a solution. So it's an interesting thing about anger, because anger is this, the energy of anger, I mean, I won't go into it in detail because it's not really appropriate, but in Tantra, the energy of anger is actually not the same as hatred. It's not, I mean, sorry, I should rephrase that. Anger rides on an energy which is not necessarily one that has to have hatred associated with it. It's a firmness, a clarity, it's a cutting through, it's, you know, boom. But the hatred aspect, which makes it, you know, angry and so forth, that's something which is destructive. Whereas, you know, this firm, clear, straight to the point, you know, attitude and energy is actually something which is very, very useful for us. And the first person that we have to use it on is really ourselves. You know, this is like, let's cut through the BS here, you know, boom. So this is why in Buddhism, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism, you have these Buddhas, for example, like Manjushri, and Manjushri will have a wrathful emanation, such as Vajrabharava and so forth, or even a, you know, a form of Manjushri that is more wrathful. These don't equate with hatred. They don't equate with normal anger. They're just this straightforward, firm, cutting through, boom. It's just, you know, that's it. So how do we even begin to digest that and to work with that, you know, in real terms in our own lives? What we're doing when this kind of thing happens, what we're doing when the anger comes up, as, you know, and the hatred and fear and all that stuff, is we are reacting because we have something to lose. We feel we have something to lose. And that thing that we feel that we have to lose is actually a false value. So what is this false value? And this false value is that the way we're perceiving ourselves and others is as if they are and we are something which is independently existing by itself, by ourselves, and something which has its own inherent existence. And often, the back of our mind somewhere is this feeling of that it's eternal. Even if the body dies, we will be eternal. I will be, you know, and so forth. So this is kind of a false value which is put onto the phenomena called, you know, living beings and other things as well, of course, which makes us get very unbalanced. And the problem is that this is not something that, it's not necessarily something we've learned culturally. It's something which we have in us innately from many beginningless time. And it's what we call, it's a product of ignorance. And ignorance in Buddhism, as I described, I think 2 weeks ago, is not necessarily not knowing something, but it's more, it's more a darkness of the mind. And it's this darkness of the mind that prevents us from seeing clearly. And we adhere to it because it seems so real. When we walk down the dark alley, which I talked about last time, when we walk down the dark alley and we see a coil of rope and we think it's a snake. And we firmly believe it's a snake. And we react to it as if it's a snake, whether it's fear or anger and so forth. But in fact, it's just a coil of rope. It's a simplistic example, but it really describes what's going on with ignorance. So this ignorance, if we looked at what we call dependent arising, how things arise the way we are now, how we arise the way we are. Is anybody here familiar with the 12 links of dependent arising in Buddhism? Yeah. Okay, so basically it's described in the wheel of life. You'll have these 12 pictures or 12 links, if you like, which depict this process. And actually, it's not necessarily a straightforward process, but these are the things. Each step or each link is what allows the next link to exist, if you like, or to be. So first is ignorance, which is this darkness of the mind. And what happens when you have this darkness of the mind is that you will have impulses. And these impulses, when they accompany actions, they become what we call karmic imprints. So when you have these intentions, these impulses, then you act on them. They are called compositional factors. They will form a trace. And that's the next step, because you will have the consciousness. The third link is this consciousness, which actually has two parts. So the first part of that consciousness is that moment when something is traced into it. So there's a consciousness. It's subtle. It's not necessarily something that is, a day-to-day consciousness, but that compositional factor, that karmic imprint, is printed onto that in the sense that it leaves an impression, and the next moment of mind, that's brought over. So the mind is constantly bringing these impressions over. And we have then this consciousnesses. Now with the consciousness, we're going to do kind of a bigger jump here. And what we have, the next link is called, it's called name and form. Now, this is Buddhist shorthand for name is the mind. So we'll have, out of the components of the mind, you'll have feelings, you'll have what's it called in English? It's apprehension. It's how it's the mind takes hold of things. So it's kind of like cognition. That's it. That's the word. It's a cognition. It might not be perfect at cognition. It's more cognition. Something's going on where you actually are aware of something. And then there are these compositional factors, which we had earlier. And then you will have consciousnesses, which is the step before. So these four in the human life, or any form of life that has form, then conjoin with the form at the moment of conception. If it's a womb, it's in the womb. If it's in an egg, it happens in the egg. So it's these two energies of the male and female come together. And so in these types of births, that's the next step that comes together. And once you have this combination, now it's a lot more technical than this, but I'm just going to do a very short kind of exposition of it. So once you have this name and form, then you have the base for what's called, the 6 bases, the 6 senses, the 5 sensory senses and the mental sense. You have, these are consciousnesses and actual organs. So once you have these, the next thing becomes very obvious, which is contact. When contact is when consciousness, the object of consciousness, and the actual organ of consciousness, if you like, they come together in the sense of it's registered. That's contact. Okay. So all of that, those first six of those, they are fairly interlinked between psychophysical things that are going on. Now, in actual birth, well, let's not go there yet. So once you have this contact, there's a thing that happens automatically once you have contact, and that's feeling. Like, you see something, you taste something, you touch something, you hear something, you think of something, and that's when you think of something, the mental consciousness and the mind and the whatever it is in the mind come together. Boom, that's contact. So you have, when the contact happens, a feeling arises, and that is automatic. There's nothing you can do about that. You will automatically, if you taste hot food, you go, hot food. You might like it. That's the feeling that arises. You might dislike it. That's another feeling that arises. You might not care. It's neutral to you. So what's interesting about this feeling thing is that this feeling is actually a karmic result. It's a conditioning that's in your mind that, has made that feeling to be what it is, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. You can be conditioned to, we talked about hot food. You can be conditioned to hot food and liked it all the time, and so, it's a pleasant experience. You could not have eaten it. You could have been living on bread and cheese and peanut butter for all your life, and suddenly you get, you get a jalapeno, and you just. I have a very short story. I have to put this in. I have a very good friend who's passed away now in Sumba from many, many years ago. And when I was staying with him in the 80s, early 80s, he told me this story when he was back in Sumba, and he said the first time he went to Surabaya, he was on the ship, and the ships didn't have any food. He didn't realize that they didn't have food, provide any food, and it took about 3 or 4 days. So he was taken under the wing of a Sabunese family, and the Sabunese often survive long periods of days just on this palm sugar, what they call nira, the liquid sugar, and very little else. So by the time he got to Surabaya, he was pretty hungry. He was a big guy. Jack was a big guy. Jack Wero. He was a big guy. And when he got to Surabaya, he was really hungry, And he got off the boat, and he saw this guy selling this soup, and it was steaming. It was steaming, and he was like, he was so hungry. He saw this, and he ran over, and he said, Mas, how much is it? And he put down how much money he had, and the guy gave him a bowl. And he didn't even think, he just slurped it up, and he freaked out. He spat it out and said, what's this? He had never had ice before in his life. This was like 1950, 1960, whatever. And so in Sumba, there was no refrigerators. And, so he had this terrible experience. It was this feeling that it was just overwhelmingly weird, and he spat it out. And I laughed so hard when he told me the story, but I understood it. I completely could see the picture, So our feelings are preconditioned, and we can't do anything about it. He couldn't do anything about that feeling. Now, this is where. At this point, this is where we have an opportunity. Because after feeling, we have what's called craving. There's a nice feeling. Who'd like some more? That was nice. Can I have some more cheese and peanut butter? That's a weird combination. But, can I have some more of that? And that's if you like it. But if you don't like it, you have a craving for the opposite. Get that away from me. He spits the ice out. Bah. You have a craving for it never to happen again. Because it's unpleasant. And of course, if this applies to more extreme things, it's much more overwhelming. So this craving, and then if you have a kind of a neutral thing which is okay, and you say, oh yeah, I can live with that, and you have this craving for just to kind of float along with it, So this craving is the tricky bit, because it's actually probably the only point so far in these 7 links where you can actually do something about it. Because your reaction to your feeling, if you don't control it, it escalates. So the craving will escalate into what we call grasping. Now this grasping is a difficult thing. This is a very dangerous phase, because this grasping, when we have this grasping, you are overwhelmed. It's like you're overwhelmed with this wanting either to get away from it, or which can turn to hatred, or wanting to have it. And there are different types of grasping. There's the grasping for things that are desirable, etc. But one of the things that is a very primary issue with grasping is what the Buddha called grasping itself. The Buddha talked about grasping itself in the very first teaching he gave, and I talked about this before. And he said, first he said, this is suffering, dukkha. Look at the dissatisfaction in your mind. You're constantly looking for something. And what's causing that dissatisfaction is this grasping, because you are holding on to this idea of a inherently existing self, an independently existing self. I, and as my friend Alex Brazin likes to say, it's like an I with a big black line around it. It's like, this is me, I. And if you're inside the line, your mind, you're my friend, it's okay. If you're outside the line, then it's them. Okay? So this, fundamentally, this grasping, it sets us up. What happens with this grasping is that in the energy of becoming, of existence, of, particularly in the case of a rebirth, that grasping triggers, in the rebirth process, it triggers you to the existence, to the next existence. Boom. In some translations it's called becoming. In other translations it's called existence. But what it does is it throws you into the next link, and of course, this is very specific, I think, to belief in reincarnation. But at that point, you're pulled by your grasping, or the grasping throws you rather into this kind of momentum, and off you go. You're on the way, and then you will have, after that, the next link will be birth. So you actually end up being born. And then you have old age and death. And then it repeats. And then you go through, and so this is terrible. It's like this tumbler in a washing machine, just going around and around and around. And the main two things which cause that are the ignorance and the grasping. So these are what they relate to in what we were talking about earlier, in what we're seeing, in, for example, in the examples about the world and the racism and the fear and the hatred and all that stuff, is this grasping. Because when the feeling has arisen, we haven't been careful to pull ourselves up. Stop the hatred. Stop the fear. Look at it for what it is. It's a terrible thing. And we should be, actually, what we should do is direct our feeling of dislike to the delusion that makes the people this way, and not the people. And it's a very difficult thing to do, because we tend to always associate, because of the way we grasp at existences of ourselves and others, we just say, okay, this guy over here, he's the bad guy. He did a bad thing. We often so conveniently forget stupid things that we've done under deluded, premises and under stupid, circumstances and so forth. We forget that all living beings, every single living being, has the potential to become a Buddha, what we call Buddha nature. And we just look at, and we this is where the damage to ourselves happen, is that we look at, well, let's just call a spade and that kind of thing, blah, blah. Let's look at Trump. And we just look at Trump and we are just completely overwhelmed, or 90% of us or 80% of us. I don't know what the polls are saying now, but anyway. We are looking at that person saying that what a terrible person. Not many of us look at that person and think, wow, this poor guy. He's locked himself into this position where he cannot exit from it. He's so caught up with, this probably with some deep fear of being ridiculed and being pulled to pieces and being et cetera, but he keeps going into it and gets worse and worse, and he's basically, something's deranged there. And so what we should be looking at is like, oh, this person has a terrible problem. And I know that what I'm speaking of is an ideal, but from a Buddhist perspective, this ideal is actually quite important because it affects our happiness as well. We become unhappy. We lose our clarity. We identify, now this is the tricky bit, because just as we identify the negativity with that person, we identify with our hatred. Our hatred or our fear consumes us. We have no distance from it anymore. And this is something which is certainly not beneficial for our happiness, for our clarity. We become our own victims. And without even realizing it, it's a very sad state of affairs, actually. We're afraid, for example, that if we don't react, that we are actually remiss. Something's wrong with us that we don't. But it's okay. I mean, I think it's perfectly fine to react. I think it's perfectly fine to be firm and to say something. It's just we need to keep our perspective. If we don't keep our perspective, we're lost. We're just as lost as him. That's the scary bit. And I totally sympathize with the people who are demonstrating, and I understand. I sympathize in the sense that I understand whether the violence is useful or not. That's a different story. But I understand because they have suffered so much. People have suffered so much, and at that point, of course, we can feel compassion for them, but can we feel compassion for the perpetrator? That's the big challenge. For this guy who so lost his humanity that he put his knee on this person's neck for 9 minutes when there was no reason to do that. There's absolutely no reason to do that. But if we are to live as a society of, of human beings and as civilized human beings, we need to deal with that. But we can't get to the point where we want to kill that person, because then we're doing the same thing. So it's a bit tricky. And I do appreciate that, some people feel that, some Buddhists rather, feel that we should just not say anything, that we should step back from it. But I don't think that's correct, because these are our demons. And when the Buddha sat under the tree, under the Bodhi tree, to overcome the demons, what he has explained also is that, there's this broad category of 4 types of maras. Now, maras I loosely translated as demons. It's not quite right, because some of the maras are temptresses or tempters. They're not all demonic, but But the four of these, three of them are internal, in the sense that they are really our situation, not an external situation. And the first and foremost of these are what we call the kleshas. That's a Sanskrit word and it's Pali word, klesha, which roughly can be translated as deluded disturbances in our mind, disturbing mental factors, delusions. And there are many of these. We talk about 6 primary kleshas and 21, secondary ones. But, I do remember one Lama saying, actually, there's thousands of them. There's thousands of these disturbing mental factors, but, they're all permutations. But the main ones are these 6. And of the 6, which are ignorance, hatred, attachment, arrogance, vacillation, and wrong views. These are the primary ones, but the most important of those 6, even again, if you distill it even further, are the 3, what we call 3 mental poisons: ignorance, hatred, and attachment, because that represents the 3 different directions. So you have ignorance is actually the base of it all, because it's that darkness of mind, and it's not seeing things as the way they are. And once you start not seeing yourself and others for what they truly are, passing phenomena, etc., impermanent, changing, and so forth, you get into trouble because you start ascribing more value to it. This is a wonderful person, the most beautiful person, nothing, blah, 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 blah. And you then have this possibility, if you think it's a wonderful person because you appreciate the goodness, that's nothing wrong with that. But if you become attached because you've put on a greater value there, then because the person will pass, then you get into trouble. Or if you see, as we said earlier, you identify this bad action and so forth attitude with that person's a bad person and that's all they are, and you see it that way, then you will be consumed by the anger and the hatred. So these 3 poisons, these 3 mental poisons, they're really something else. They rule us. But what's so fascinating about these mental poisons and all mental factors, in fact, is that they are not indeed permanent. They are not indeed eternal. What is continuous in the mind is simply the awareness. Our mind's the simple fact of being aware, and you can call it clear mind, you can call it whatever, the primordial mind, etc., etc., etc. But it's basically we can be aware. But that awareness gets a focus from different mental factors, and the emotional ones, such as ignorance and so forth, they focus it in a certain way. They focus it into hatred. But there are other mental factors, loving kindness. There are also, wisdom, understanding the nature of things. There is faith in the sense of, in the positive sense of something when you really understood something properly and examined it and understood the real true nature of things, and you have faith in it because the confidence comes from your conviction from, and so forth. So there are different types of mental factors. So in fact, what we can do is not despair, ignorance, hatred, and attachment, and just want to go kill yourself because, gosh, we're stuck. Actually, we know that we can reduce this, we can change this, and that's what Buddhist practice is about. That's what Buddhist practice is all about, through the practice of studying and learning, and then we digest what we've learned. We contemplate it, we reflect on it until we get the aha, that's how it works. And that you take, and that's what you meditate on. So through this process, but the study it's very important to understand how the mind is working, and these times that we're experiencing now are like illustrations for us to look at. And look what's happening here, And we can stop and look at ourselves too, how we get caught up in it. I I'm just assuming because I think some of you are much more calm than I am. But you know, I watch these things and I just go like, oh my goodness, you know, this guy just killed somebody for no other reason than, you know, and then we find out that they worked in the same club, and it's so weird, the whole complication of it, and you just have to look at that and you realize that this is the nature of samsara. This is the nature of that conditioned existence. There is nothing in this type of conditioned existence that really has a value that is worth clinging to. In fact, the only values that we can really work with and are really useful to us, wisdom, loving kindness, you know, compassion, these are the things that really have value. And these other things, the hatred and so forth, I mean, people need this person who did this. There's no question that he should be, you know, be taken to trial and you know, as fair as possible. There's no question, because that's the pact that we have in a civilization. That's our contract. You know, we agree to work together in fairness and so forth and so forth. And these are the bottom lines, you know, and they're, you know, killing in any context, killing somebody, especially a person, you know, the bigger the being, you know, and the more intelligent the being, the worse it is, you know. That's just not on in any situation, you know. We have fought wars, so many wars throughout history, and none of those wars brought us any happiness, anything of great value. All it brought was bitter memories and revenge. You know, I can't think of any area in the world where wars have brought anything of any value. You know, and it's everybody. I mean, sometimes people think that, you know, Tibetans have always been gentle and loving and kind. And so, you know, when you look at the wars that the Tibetans had with the Mongolians, you know, tough stuff. You know, there was some really terrible things that went on, and so forth. You know, I mean, nobody's exempt. It's this thing in human nature that once we let ourselves be overcome and consumed with these delusions, we're lost. And the thing about anger that's so seductive is that it gives us this false sense of power. You think, you know, you can push through the bam, you know, the power. It's not entirely off beam. I mean, that sense of you know, directness is really, it is a powerful thing, but when you mix it with hatred, when hatred's involved, then it's a complete boomerang. It comes back and it's a killer. But we are seduced by that power. You know, what do you mean you're going to, you know, bam? You know, you get in there and you deal with it, and only later do you realize, or hopefully later do you realize that, you know, what a mess you just made. I'm rather expert in this field. I have much experience in this field. Unfortunately, but hopefully next lifetime I'll have it more under control. I don't know. I once asked this, and I had an audience, one audience I had with His Holiness, and I asked him, you know, he says, well, what's your question today, you know? And I said, well, anger. And he said, oh, anger. And you know, it was like, it was almost like man's worst enemy, you know, anger. Oh, anger, that's a difficult one. So I think I will stop now. If there are questions, I would welcome. You're perfectly, you know, please, if you have some questions, don't be shy.
Yeah, could you, is there such a thing as a communal karma?
That's kind of a sideways question. But anyway, yeah, I personally don't believe it. The question for those who are watching and probably didn't hear because the mic, I don't know if it picked up the question. But Charlie just asked the question is there such a thing as communal karma? Common karma in common. I don't believe such a thing. I think that I personally have read and discussed it, different opinions from different Buddhist friends of mine, but I think that we all have our individual imprints from the things that we've done and the things, our own impulses and so forth. But we do tend to hang with people who are similar to us. That's like in street speak. We tend to hang with people who are on the same wavelength with us, and so forth and so forth. There's a famous expression, birds of a feather, flock together, and so forth. I think karmically, then you can go further if you talk in Buddhist terms of reincarnation, is that we tend to get reincarnated in similar places because of our karmas, which are similar. If you look at the different types of karmas that govern rebirth, the governing karma, the kind of rebirth, the karma that affects the environment, the karma that affects your own, reaction to that, and so forth. Those, they are the specificity, specifically they're our own karmas, but we can have done similar things that lead to that. And there also often we will see over many lifetimes that in fact we have interacted with all living beings. So they've all been mom and dad and lovers and enemies and in the first.
So the fact that there's this COVID-19 virus, on the karmic level, it's a part of every individual's karma that this is happening?
Okay, the question now was, is the COVID-19 part of every individual karma? In a sense, yes. If you were going to be very, nitpicking about it, yes. But really what it is part of the environment. It's part of the environment to which we are born. And because we are born into an environment where, for example now, where people are going to places where they shouldn't be going and destroying environments that they shouldn't be destroying, we're getting these results. Some of us will die, some of us won't. And that is determined by our individual karma. But the presence of the COVID virus, for example, now that's something which is environmental. The racism, the racial suppression and stuff that is happening, that has happened over centuries. That is something which is a cultural and it's a societal thing, but it is part of, in a sense, it is part of the karma, But you have to be very careful with that kind of thing because we all have karmic potential for terrible things to happen to us. So, if somebody says, oh, well, that's a racist thing to say because what you're saying is that, black people have this karma to be, but actually everybody has a karma like this. It just depends on the situation, and the conditions which allow those karmas to come up. Now, there is just absolutely no justification for racism. But interestingly enough, it can be experienced by just about anybody in a certain way, But really, what's much more important is that we are all loaded with all kinds of karmas. And when they manifest is a little bit beyond our capacity to see. The Buddha refused, well, not didn't refuse, but the Buddha, one thing about the Buddha is that he could tell. He could explain. He could see karmas working. We can't. It's a very hidden thing. But there was an example when the Buddha was alive that somebody came to him with the ashes of, I don't know, several different trees mixed together and asked the Buddha, what tree was this from? And the Buddha picked out this one. This is from here, this was from here, this was from there, this was yay old, this was this thing, and this was burned last time. And because the clarity of his mind was at such a point where, you know, there's no grasping, there's no clinging. This is an important thing with Buddhism, is that we need to understand that although we do develop things like compassion, but really basically the most important thing is getting rid of the negative things, because we all have this potential in us. We have tremendous potential in us, and that's the tragedy of this, you know, this cop, or the person who was killed, or all the opponents. The tragedy is that we all have this incredible capacity. It's just clouded over and crowded over with all these delusions and all this terrible stuff. We do have it. We do have the Buddha potential, and that's something which tends to get glossed sometimes. We forget that. Is that okay? So yes.
You explained the dependent arising, and the sixth step being the feeling that we can't do anything about, and then the seventh was the clinging, and which makes us problematic, and that creates the karma, or maybe even cause the karma, whatever. But my question was, so besides the importance of understanding that, is there any practice you would recommend to
Yes.
follow with that?
I mean, there are many different practices. But the most important thing is that when the feeling arises, that you recognize that it is a feeling, and that feeling is something which is karmic. And so that you're not going to immediately, because of that feeling, ascribe to whatever happened that, you're bad, or, this is bad. It's just a phenomena. We say, this is beautiful, that's ugly. That's something which we've learned. And then it becomes incorporated into our feelings. Ooh, that's horrible. Oh, that's nice. And then we act on it. And when we crave, that's the dangerous phase. And we need to say, then you start to grasp, and then you lose it. So when you ask me, what is the practice? Now, there are different practices. For hatred, we will work on loving kindness. For attachment, we will work on analyzing the thing that we're attached to. What is it really? It's a bunch of atoms. Like, for example, if you have a sexual attraction, then you can do a meditation where you just analyze the body of this person who you're madly insane about, and you just see, okay, well, you take the skin off and there's the fat, and you take that off and there's the gristle, and and there's all the shit in the intestines, and and all this sort of stuff, and you can do that. I mean, and it reduces the attachment. Yeah, you don't have to get obsessed with it, but it's just a way of monks will meditate with corpses sometimes. So the thing is, you have what we call antidotes to these disturbances, but the most important thing is to recognize that they are disturbances, first of all, and to see the detriment. That's really important, to see the detriment that comes from these demons. So that's the kleshas. That's the first type of demon Mara. The second type of Mara is the actual aggregates, the forms and the form and the mind that we have, which are obtained in this contaminated manner, because they're like a time bomb. They will deteriorate. The mind, there is karma going on. So they are these potentials. And then the third type of internal demon is death. We don't know how to deal with death. And that's a demon in the sense that if we don't know how to deal with death, when we die, we can get into some really hot water. Instead of passing through it as a transition, we get messed up again. Then you have the external demons. But if you can control these three internal demons, or get on top of them, these external demons have no power. Because they're predicated on your own projecting on them. Does that make sense?
But when you say you deal with death, how do you accept that, or
Well, I mean, you do have to accept it because it's going to happen. I mean, that's for sure. There's no way out of that one. There's nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide. With that one, But it is important to meditate on death and meditate on the process of death, and to understand that it is a transition, and that during that transition, different things will happen. Now, this is very specific to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, because in the traditions of the southern traditions, there is not much discussion about the Antarbhava, the bardo state. There's not much discussion about that at all. Whereas in the Tibetan tradition, there's a lot of discussion about that. And the discussion there is that what we're experiencing when we go through the death process is really, first of all, the dissolutions of the elements. And when we talk about the dissolution of the elements, they are things which are actually what we experience: solidity, the earth, solidity. Then the fluid, the water. That's the fluidity that we experience. Then you have fire, the warmth. Then you have the dissolution of air, which is movement, this mobility and so forth. These are things which we experience in a certain manner, according to the meditations that you do. They call them dissolutions. But really, eventually, is what you're going to go to is you're going to get to a point where even consciousness will dissolve. And then you'll have a moment where it's like a total blackout. It's like fainting. It's complete blackout. And then you come out into, hopefully, into an awareness of the clear light, which is, just the awareness of the lack of inherent existence of all things. It's like what we call shunyata. There's an experience in a sense of being in experiencing this emptiness in a certain way. Really, the details is too technical, but what then transpires is, if you don't have the training, that moment is barely recognized. That moment of clear light, it's barely recognized. It's so fast. It's like boom. And actually, we do experience. It's a very funny thing, but you do experience it when you sneeze, or when you have orgasm. You have like what they call le petit mot, in French. There's a moment where you snap right out of the whole conceptualization, and you snap out of all, and it's but it's very fast, and it is le petit mot, isn't it, in French? Le petit mot. Oops. I've avoided trouble with genders. I don't know why things have to have genders. It's bad enough that we have genders. Anyway, and German's worse. They got neutral as well. So you really, probably most of us, without, because we don't really have enough training, and we haven't trained, and can't hold that space. It's just, it goes by. And then you're going pell-mell into another thing, because what you then start to see is you start to see these various emanations of, maybe demonic, maybe angelic, I don't know, but they are dependent on your own mind's projections. They are projections of your own mind. And if you read the Bardo Todo, they say, son of a good family, these are the projections. Know that these are the projections of your own mind. So you're projecting stuff, which is actually what we do most of the time, even in our lifetime. We're projecting everything. But that power of projection, when we die, becomes very, very strong. We really, it becomes so real to us. So if we don't have the training, that's why the death can be called a Mara, a demon, because if we don't understand that process and don't know how to deal with that, that demon will lead us to a bad rebirth. Or an unfortunate rebirth. And these are things which are possible for everybody. We can't really condemn somebody who's, got really, that person has really bad karma. It's a stupid way to talk about it, because we all have all kinds of karma, but it's what triggers it. And the grasping triggers the karma, the resulting karma. That's the big thing. That's the other side of the story. When coming back to your question, what can we do, is you have to be careful of the grasping, because the grasping can trigger the resultant aspect of the karma. So when we're going through the death process, it's if possible, if we can meditate through it. That's I mean, I had teachers who've done it. I have one teacher in particular. I mean, one geshe in particular, wonderful geshe, who he was proclaimed dead by the Indian doctors, but he in the middle of the monsoon in Dharamsala, which is, if you've been in the monsoon in Dharamsala, it's pretty wet and, you know, steamy. His body stayed fresh for, I don't know, I think it was about 7 days. You know, His Holiness the Secretary was staying with him at that time, and he told me, you know, Geshe-la's body maintained for several days, and then there's the point where the consciousness leaves the body. But what he's doing, what the person is doing in that state is meditating on the clear light. Those is clear light meditation. And that, the body just, because the body and the mind are so close together during the life, so the body is affected by that. And when you have very good concentration, that's another thing, concentration is very important too. If you can develop a really, really good concentration and get to what we call shamatha, which is you know, I can't remember anything today, calm, you know, the calm abiding in the mind, which is a very special state of mind, the body automatically becomes flexible. You don't have to put up 10 cushions and arrange your knee in a certain way or whatever, you know. It just becomes flexible, and it can stay, and your mind becomes flexible, which in these terms, in Buddhist terms, means that it just does what you want it to do. You sit, your mind stays on the object, doesn't matter how long, boom. So when this clear light meditation is going on in the death process, that's what happens. Whether we can do that, that will take practice. So I think my time is up. The clock is blinking 5. Sampai sini aja ya? Okay. So thank you all for coming. And listen, before we all sign off, please, it would be great if you just took a minute to just think how important these things are for us, for our happiness and the happiness of others. And try and promise yourself that you will continue to work with this and to improve your minds and to improve, all of us, to improve our minds and improve our responses and our kindness and compassion, and reduce the hatred and the ignorance and the attachment in our lives for the sake of all living beings, including ourselves. So please think that. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you for watching. If you find our videos informative and helpful, please consider contributing to our effort.